All right, it is 9:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and as promised, we are going to be talking about did Noah's Ark really happen and what's in a genre. So on the panel today, I have General Han Solo, Floyd, and the other Wayne. Hold on 1 minute, my phone's guys. Talk amongst yourself.
General Han Solo and I had a debate about this because it was Steve McRae's channel a few months back, I think. And General's position was that it was a historical event, but it was a local flood. My view was that the Bible describes a worldwide flood with a flat Earth cosmology. And it's pretty much fiction. It does come from earlier stories, most likely the Epic of Gilgamesh. But I don't think it's historic at all, because for it to be historic, it would have to describe a global flood. But I don't think it describes a global flood. I think it was written in the contents of a flat Earth, and for it to be historical, I mean, it would just be impossible to have a ark like that made of gopher wood to be able to float and to have 8 people maintain all those animals and so forth with their special diets for all those days. It's just purely fiction. That's my position on the story.
Well, since we got your position, General, what's your position? This is going to be interesting.
My position is that the story advocates a local catastrophe. There's also a supernatural element to it. That being, well, I'm not saying that the flood was a supernatural element. I believe the flood was a natural disaster that happened, but there's a supernatural context behind what the ancient Near Eastern people understood to be the mountains of God and the different gods that were warring with Yahweh and the corruption of the human bloodline in the region and the whole Nephilim context. So I don't see the story as saying that all of humanity was wiped out, just as not all the Nephilim were wiped out. And therefore, the species of animals around the planet, I don't see the story as saying that was wiped out. And there's a common memory in the ancient Near East that we shouldn't really be afraid of. That, if you were to read the Epic of Gilgamesh in light of the Genesis story, so be it. I don't see any reason why we should try and refute that.
So right now, it seems like I have not seems like, I was going to say young Earth, but it's more of a global flood versus the local flood thing we got going on here. What about somebody like me who I honestly think that the flood account is a mythos. I don't know if it did happen, as well as I don't know if the biblical account happened the way it's recorded. I would say it's probably recollected, or like you said, it comes from a common memory of a real catastrophic event. And as generations go on, and as people evolve and blah blah blah, the story changes over time, and people put different theological elements into it. So me personally, I don't think it's necessarily historical. I think it's a mythos. So what would you guys say to somebody like me, who I'm just like, I don't really care if it's if it's literal?
Well, I think it is a myth. In fact, critical scholars point out that in chapters 6 through 8, there's actually 2 interwoven stories. There's from different sources, J source and P source, with different facts, and they took the 2 stories and just intertwined them. So I mean, it's hard to just take the story literally or try to make any sense out of it. I can actually show you the differences between the two stories. This is actually from my debate I had with Han Solo. There's the J source and the P source, and here's how they differ from each other. You can actually Google this. Just Google two flood stories of the Bible, and it'll actually tell you what verses are from each story. But the J source refers to God as the Lord or Yahweh, where the P source refers to God as God or Elohim in the Hebrew. The J source has 7 pairs of clean and unclean animals, where the P source has 1 pair of each kind of animal. The J source, the flood lasts 40 days and 40 nights, where in the P source, the flood lasts 370 days. The J source, Noah sends out a dove, or in the P source, he sends out a raven. And also in the J source, it depicts a more anthropomorphic God that grieves and regrets, personally closes the ark, and smells Noah's sacrifice with delight. Where in the P source, it just depicts a more transcendent controller of the universe. So, the fact you have 2 different stories, it describes it's to be interpreted in a flat Earth cosmology, and how the story is just not physically possible, within a global environment, as far as saving all those animals and accounting for how kangaroos got to Australia and the special diets and so forth that be required to maintain all those animals. It's fiction. It's a myth, and I don't take it seriously. It's not something that that shapes my worldview. It's just an old myth that I don't think is really that relevant anymore.
Wayne, I do have a question for you. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
I was going to ask you, because I know you got brought up in the church, and so this whole thing with like Noah's flood and like Noah built in an ark, and these flood waters coming, when you were younger, how were you taught about the flood? Like, what were you taught to believe about the flood, and like, what did the flood when you were younger?
I mean, nothing really specific. I mean, just normally, how the Bible teaches about the flood. Just it's nothing really out of the ordinary. Because I have never really like when I first met you. I guess when I met you, you really got me thinking outside the box on a lot of stuff. So it's like you really give some good questions and really some good insight on the flood and really got digged in deeper into it. But normally when I was raised in church, my pastor really just taught about basically what the Bible teaches about it. The same thing you read in the Bible about the flood, the same thing they teach. They just explain it to you. Why did God have the flood? Now that's the question. The question is, why did God have the flood? And the answer to that is the reason why he had the flood because he was showing them people that was one way that he was going to destroy the world is by having people. I think at that time he was trying to show people their sin, what these sin caused. People sinned it so much to the fact that I think it was something like that. It basically was something like, that, like when Noah, God used that as an example of saying that that was his way of going to destroying the world through water. And he protected his people through Noah by building that ark. And that was like basically how that went about. That was an example of him protecting his people by building that ark, building that boat. So that boat was built to be, to protect them through that water. I mean, through the flood. So that's what I was really taught when I was growing up. That God had the flood to destroy the world at that time. And,
That time.
and so Noah tried to warn the people, his family and his friends, and they would listen to him, so they got destroyed through the flood. So that was kind of really like the base of the story of what I got.
But yeah, that was the crux basically. But everybody in this room basically, like when it comes to like if you guys grew up in like Christianity, that was basically what all of us in this room basically was taught, right? Worldwide flood. Noah builds a boat that's like, I don't know how many cubits was it, General? 600 cubits, something like that. And he took all the animals in the world, and God flooded the planet. That's what all of us in this hangout was taught as a child. And I guess some of us in this hangout, as we got older and as our cognitive faculties worked a little bit better, we started to question it. Like, I don't think there would be enough water coming from the sky to rain, to destroy the planet. And we start questioning stuff like that. And I know for me, it definitely has changed. But what do you guys think as far as how do you guys think the flood story has changed over time? You know what? I've never been to a church where like any of the church members or the pastors have spoken about how the story has evolved over the years. Because what we think about the flood today, I don't think is the original interpretation of the flood. So anybody who wants to speak up, you can.
Yeah, it's actually true. My debate with Han Solo actually did talk about that. Let me show you where the slides were actually talk about that. I'll read it. But according to the New Advent Catholic Encyclopedia, till about the 17th century, it was generally believed that the deluge had been has been geographically universal, and this opinion is defended even in our day by some conservative scholars. But 200 years of theology and scientific study devoted to the question has thrown so much light in it. So, with modern times with science and so forth, it's become difficult. So, in the last 200 years, it's starting to be interpreted in different ways. But historically, the early church fathers, up to the 17th century, according to the New Advent Catholic Encyclopedia, it was always interpreted as a geographically worldwide flood. And here are some of the early church fathers that believed it was worldwide. Justin Martyr, Theophilus of Antioch, Tertullian, Gregory of Nazianzus, I'm saying that right, John Chrysostom, I butchered that name, St. Augustine, of course, and also Jewish writers, Philo of Alexandria and Josephus, all believed it was worldwide. So, it was only until our modern scientific understanding when people started to interpret it differently, because they said, well, okay, we have to make sense of this story with our new general revelation. And general revelation is that the world is global, that it's much larger than we thought it was, and we have to account for all these animals and different continents and so forth. So, all these different interpretations have come up. There are allegorical interpretations of the flood as well. Even in the New Testament, the writer of, I believe, Second Peter, pull out First Peter, I'm sorry, compares it to baptism. So in First Peter, we read Noah building an ark, and just a few, that is 8 persons who were saved through water. Baptism, which corresponds to this, now you are saved. So the author of First Peter is comparing the Noah's flood story, saving 8 persons through water, with baptism, which saves Christians from sin. And also there's other interpretation. There's both modern Christian and Jewish commentaries promoting an allegorical viewpoint. And what else? Origen viewed the ark as having a pyramid shape, and the same as the Dead Sea Scrolls, they expressed a pyramid ark as well. St. Augustine viewed the dimensions of the ark corresponding to the dimensions of a human body of Christ in the church. And the dimensions of the ark were viewed as allegorical by Hippolytus, who understood them as a sign of the times, as for the timing of Christ's coming. But of course, according to a 2004 ABC News poll, 60% of Americans believe that the story of Noah's Ark is literal and has a global flood. So it's sort of the different views.
And changed according to the times and et cetera, et cetera. But Richard just came in. And so Richard, speak, my son.
Hey guys.
Hey, Rich.
Yeah, I would just quickly jump in and say that I would debate probably 90% of those points. The last points Floyd made about the pyramid shape and the human body, and yeah, those are things that Augustine and the others mentioned. But the geographical extent and this language of universality, that's the thing, Floyd. You need to be careful because when you actually look at, say, Augustine's work, and actually I can pull up the quotes adjacent to his mention of the flood. He ponders if there are human beings inverted on the other side of the planet. So even in his day, they were debating on the spherical nature of the planet, whether it's flat or a sphere. They basically settle on the sphere language because you'll see there in their writings that the planets are around the Earth. Obviously, it's still geocentric in their thinking. So the other planets that revolve around the Earth they call it the spheres. So if they're spheres, then obviously our planet should be a sphere. But then Augustine's like, well, if it's a sphere, then it's speaking about human beings in an upside down position. And if they're in an upside down position, that means how can water or humans on the other side of the planet be attached to the surface? And so it's quite interesting. I mean, they didn't understand gravity and how that works, but that type of thinking made him then realize that no, in a universal sense, you're speaking about that specific location that humans, in a large extent were flooded. And I'm surprised you brought up Josephus, because Josephus is the one that actually says, quoting from a Greek historian in the BC period, I think Herodotus. One sec. Sorry, I just had to answer the door. I think it's Herodotus that he's quoting from, that people were able to survive the flood by climbing onto a higher elevated hill. And Josephus mentions that, I think a verse or two prior to his mention of where the ark lands on Mount Judy, not on Mount Ararat. So, I mean, that would be my response in return. And also, have you read Gordon Wenham's take on the J and P sources in regards to 6 to 9?
No, I haven't. No, I've read different rebuttals about
he's not like Gleason Archer, who's obviously Gleason Archer is very conservative, but Gordon Wenham is basically 1 foot in your direction and 1 foot in mine. so if you want to see that bridge, how that works, I'll send that over to you.
Yeah. If you have it, I'd love to read it.
So, question for General and I guess anybody else in the chat. Well, let me get it like a raise of hands or raise of voices. How many of you guys in the chat think that the biblical Noah's flood happened like the way it was written in the Bible?
Yeah, I believe it. I believe it. 1 second.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I would say that I believe in the way that it's written in the Bible. Floyd might not agree with me, because as a young earth creationist, he would say that I'm just a compromiser of what the Bible says.
Okay.
Yeah, I believe it.
Well, didn't you listen to his presentation? He's clearly a young Earth creationist.
He's an Answers in Genesis staff, don't you know?
No, I'm not a young Earth creationist. I believe the Bible story is a myth. I believe the Bible describes a worldwide flood in a flat Earth cosmology.
Right, yeah. So you believe it's a theological myth like Robert and I do?
Yeah.
All right.
What in the world?
Yeah, I'll just quickly, let me just share my screen to show you, because I just found that, I don't know if this is appearing. Appearing to you? Wait.
Let me see. Actually, no.
You may have to broadcast.
Yeah, let me broadcast you. Present to everyone.
Okay, so
I can't see your screen.
You can't see it?
No, well, at least it's not showing up on my end.
Okay, what about now?
No, hold on. Let me stop presenting you and see what happens. No, okay. I see something. Let me present you.
Hey, whose channel are we on right now?
Mine.
We're on Wins.
I did see something. Let me see if it's showing on as long as it's showing on your side, then that's fine. Nope. Well, okay. I see something else. Now
You see it now?
Yes, I see it now.
I see
Can
it.
anybody?
Okay.
Okay.
So Gordon Wenham is like, he spent like 30, 40 years of his life, you know, looking at Genesis. So this is his ultimate magnum opus, you know, Genesis commentary. And under the, from chapter 6 to 9 in the flood story, so he goes through the form and structure of it. And when you go right down to the very sources of it, I don't know if this is big enough for you. Let me just make this maybe a little bit bigger. So he says here, traditionally, these chapters have been held up as a parade example of the value of the documentary hypothesis. And, you know, he goes, and this is exactly what Floyd presented. You have a J and a P division. And now this is where it gets interesting, because the Wellhausen school existed before they were discovering the Mesopotamian texts. So Wellhausen, with no knowledge of, you know, the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Mesopotamian stuff, certain peculiar nuances and similar structures in what you call the J source, the P source, actually date back to the time of Ezra. So we're talking roughly, you know, 500 BC, somewhere around there. But well, how Gordon Wenham actually says here, he says, how attractive the supplementary hypothesis may seem elsewhere in Genesis, it faces grave difficulties, specifically in chapter 6 to 9. And why is that the case? Well, he says, between the biblical flood story and the Mesopotamian parallels, it was pointed out above, can be explained either on the assumption that both go back to a common tradition, so you're talking in a minimalist context, or that the Genesis account is a deliberate rewriting of the Mesopotamian version of the flood story. On both views, then, the Hebrew storyteller must have known all those features that are found in both Mesopotamian and Genesis versions of the flood. Only those features unique to Genesis may be presumed to come from other sources or to be the writer's own contribution. It is therefore strange that both J and P versions should lack features of the common tradition, but when combined, create an account which resembles it. So what he's saying is that, yeah, you're noticing a piecework taking place. You're noticing a stitching of, in regards to, obviously in this case, what I believe and what Gordon Winner believes is an actual historical event. And yeah, you have a people group at the time, well before Moses. So obviously in this case, Noah or Utnapishtim, he would be experience this thing. So when you have a story stitched together and edited over time, and elements are added, and then you have like a final draft, which then many thousands of years later Moses gets the form in what we call Genesis. It appears, this is a word coincidentally, but it falls into that category. It appears like you would understand as the, but this is going well before the so-called Yahweh source and the priestly source were written in the 500s BC. So it's a textual form of criticism and critical work that was happening thousands of years prior to the existence of Moses. Not then attach labels of Yah source and P source onto these chapters. You literally have to, if you were to use the Wellhausen perspective in a Mesopotamian context, you'd say something like, this is the Epic of Gilgamesh source, and this is the Akkadian source or something. Like you wouldn't use the J and P terms, is what he's getting at. So
I mean, you actually think Moses wrote Genesis?
No, he would say that you have, following the Toldots tradition, Moses would receive this from tradition.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't.
And obviously, conservative say a direct revelation.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even think Moses existed. I think what's happening here is just, you had versions of the story in the southern kingdom of Judah, and then you had versions of the story in the northern kingdom of Israel. And when Israel was invaded, they migrated south to Judah, and with them they brought their stories with them, which was later incorporated into scripture. So what we find in a lot of the Pentateuch is a joining of southern versions of stories with northern versions of stories, and the flood story is no exception to that. So I generally go with the Old Testament minimalists on my view of the Old Testament, where I think a lot of it was assembled during or after the Babylonian exile. So I don't think we should be going really, obviously these stories existed before then, but I think the assembly of the Pentateuch really happened around the time of the Babylonian exile.
But just
bring up
quickly
Moses,
though, I mean,
seems absurd to me. I don't think Moses existed at all. I think
just quickly though, I could
1 minute before the Bible scholars get into another debate. I just want to get some fresh voices in on this for some people who didn't talk. Luke, Mark, Wayne. I guess what I would say is, what's your thoughts on everything?
Yeah, I don't understand how later editors acting in the 700s BC has any influence on the existence of Moses. That just seems kind of like a odd argument to make. So, I mean, I don't want to distract from the topic, but that would be the only comment I have.
All right, Wayne, what about you?
I have nothing to say.
Come on, Mark, you want to say something? I know Mark's there. Maybe
Mark probably stepped away for a minute.
But in regards to the flood, I mean, I would I would argue that I don't really need the Bible to defend the flood. I mean, very recently, we're talking up to 2010. You have Jeffrey Rose and all those scientists and archaeologists and paleontologists finding a peculiar flood event that happened in the Persian Gulf. So you have a followed human migration into that region from out of Africa, and a catastrophic flood that wiped out that entire region. And lo and behold, it's the region that occupied, you know, the emergence of Mesopotamian culture, art, religion, you know, Ur of the Chaldees, all that entire region there is affected by this flood 13,000 years ago.
Do you think, like, when you read, like, I don't know, Exodus, right? Like, say you think Moses would have known about the flood, right?
Yeah, I mean, the whole flood tradition thing is borrowed down into Moses. I mean, Moses would be like the equivalent of like a Paul, you know, Paul, who was well trained, well educated. Moses would have been in that same category in an Egyptian sense.
So I'm wondering, if we would have asked Moses, how would he interpret the flood story? Like that. I think a very good question is, what is the genre of the flood? Me, I think it's more of a mythos. I don't think they would be putting it. I don't think
Moses wouldn't.
I don't think
Moses would not give
to die on for him. I don't think they'd be trying to argue like for the historical evidence for the flood, where they try and, you know, prove through geology or something like that the flood happened.
Yeah, I don't think Moses would give an account that, say, I'm giving. But if I was to give my account to Moses, I don't see Moses disagreeing. Like, again, you have to keep in mind, if you're able to efficiently and sufficiently maintain. Oh wait, can I be heard? Am I breaking up too?
Yeah, we hear you.
Okay. So sufficiently and efficiently maintain a continual understanding of, so there's no language barriers, that we both can communicate completely. Moses understands completely my 21st century framework. I completely understand Moses's 14th century BC framework. And then Moses would be like, oh wow, yeah, you've just given like an empirical context to it. And here's my ancient Near Eastern theological context behind it as well. So I'm blending the two. Obviously, I'm speaking from hindsight here, which is something Moses didn't have. So, you know.
I do have two questions for you, General. Do you think it's fair to kind of like impose your scientific worldview on their ancient worldview? So that's my first question. I but just want to know how we.
I don't see why not. I mean, the only difference between Moses and me is that 3,400 years have transpired. In the grand scheme of things, it's nothing. It's just time has transpired. That's it. So say if I was living a week after Moses, you know, exited, not a week. Say if I was existing like 40 years after Moses. So I was born when he was 20 or something. I don't know, like a very within his lifetime. I don't even know if this analogy will work. What I'm trying to say is that the differences between Moses and when he was living versus me is that a lot of time has transpired, and obviously humans have advanced beyond imagination, beyond the imaginations of any ancient Near Eastern person. And that's the difference. It's not like Moses is living in some other world, some other universe that's so alien and foreign to our thinking, and therefore we can't ever, you know, it's the same Earth, it's the same planet, it's the same regions we walk on where Moses would have walked on. Like it's no different. And the laws of nature still apply regardless of where you are, when you've lived. So all I'm doing is giving a more scientific analysis of the story, which Moses wouldn't have even thought about doing to begin with. He's just collecting the material and giving a polemical argument.
So that will lead me into my next question, which is, if the, well, I don't think you really answered my question. Do you think the genre of Noah's Ark is historical, or do you think it's more of a theological mythos?
I think it's historical. I don't see why.
That's funny.
But I won't say that. Well, okay, I'll put it this way. I won't say the ark is the dimensions given can be understood in base 10. It has to be base 60 because Noah's age is in base 60. The ark dimensions are in base 60. So in that context, the ark would be not the size that you see Ken Ham, propose. It's just impossible for any ancient Near Eastern kingdom to make such a big boat like that. But yeah, I would propose that the reading of the text shows Noah to be a farmer. The species in that region would have been farm animals. The ark would have been sufficiently big to, like say the size of a yacht, which is completely reasonable for people 10,000 BC. Noah and the calendar dates that are given.
Yeah, just briefly, I agree with the yacht hypothesis.
Yeah,
Okay.
definitely the yacht hypothesis. It's an inside joke. The calendar that's mentioned of when the flood starts, how old Noah is, what month it starts, and so on, then allowed a tradition in ancient Judaism to pinpoint the birthday of Noah, which would be 11 September, and this is connected to Jesus being a new Noah, who's also 11 September 3 BC. And so if God exists, and if indeed this Bible story is meant to convey a grand cosmic like story, kind of like a film, where you have all these pieces interconnect each other, then I think it's deliberate. I think it's deliberate that what's mentioned with respect to Noah is then echoed in the person of Jesus, quite precisely.
So my next question is, well, it would be more in the context of somebody accepting the flood as like Dr. Heiser. Dr. Heiser, he would more than likely agree with like my interpretation. I think it's more of a mythos. It doesn't take away from the actual event happening. So I do think there was a world flood that happened somewhere, but I don't think the biblical account is exactly how it happened. I think the biblical account tries to make the point, or it tries to convey a theological message through this historical event. And so with that being the case, if you think this is a historical account, a year or two down the line, you do change your mind and you say, you know what, I think the flood account is coming from a more theological perspective than historical.
But I would argue that. Yeah, but I would argue, yeah, you have. I guess you could have a position or a foot in the what's called mythic genre, but myths here doesn't mean it's fake or unreal. Right. It has a real history. But then I can't help but also be a literalist in some sense, that what's written in there is literally what was happening. Obviously with a certain nuance in small areas like the dimensions of the ark and that sort of thing. But otherwise, broad brushstrokes. I think
my question was how can you give a scientific account of something you don't have the nitty-gritty details on, because you need precision so you can do science.
Yeah, and all I do is I I don't look at the Genesis text as the yardstick by which I investigate what was happening in that region. So that's why I brought up people like Jeffrey Rose and at least 50 other good people who specialized in researching that area, completely unaware of the biblical narrative. And so all I've done is gone, okay, you guys have done, your head is in that sort of thing. My head is in the biblical narrative. And oh, look, I've read your literature and I read the Bible narrative, and there's this like overlap with literally the same geographical markers that you're both giving, and like it's quite astonishing to see that fit. That's where I'm coming from.
Yeah, you can find a large puddle in ancient history and find comparisons to that in a flood. There's been a number of local floods in that region throughout history. So I don't think it says anything. You can say, oh yeah, see, there was a flood then. I have a flood story here. Oh, they're similar. Why? Because they're floods. But no, you have to look at the details and see if does the details actually match what's being described in some local flood. There's been a number of local floods. So I don't see how you can pick out one over the other. I think you're just trying to find some sort of comparison where it's just not there. I don't think it's an honest way to interpret the Bible. I think you need to take at least the historical grammatical method and try to interpret the Bible the way the original authors meant it to be interpreted with the original audience that he wrote for. That's the best way to understand the Bible is to actually try to understand what the original authors were trying to convey to the original audience he was writing for. A book came out recently, Noah's Flood, by Ryan Pittman, and it was a lot of news about it, and they're saying, see, there was a Black Sea deluge hypothesis. So they're saying, oh, okay, this is evidence for Noah's flood because the Black Sea was once a smaller freshwater lake, and then the Mediterranean Sea overflooded, and it went into the Black Sea, which extended it today. But there are other local floods. There's the Great Euro flood in 3500 BCE. There was the floods of Kish 3 different times. Sharuppak between 2950 and 2850. There was the flooding of the Tigris, Euphrates, Niles rivers. There are other floods. You can pick any of these floods and say, yeah, see, here's floods in history, and we have a flood story in the Bible. See, it matches. We have historical evidence. And of course, even Ryan Pittman acknowledges that that the belief in this particular flood or any other flood is in one directly experienced by Noah is an individual decision. It is not a question that can be answered by the scientific method. So even these scientists even point out that you really can't take Noah's flood and point it to any specific flood at all. This is what Ryan Pittman point out, that originally the Black Sea was just a freshwater lake, and then it overflowed to where it is today, 80 meters higher. So again, I don't think the flood story should be taken literally at all, and I think it's a mistake to trying to find some sort of historical correspondence to the story.
Yeah, I wonder, what do you think would count as evidence for the flood? Like, say you have in the history of science evidence of this great catastrophe at around the time that it's supposed to have happened in biblical history, like in the same region. You wouldn't say that would count because you can't prove that it's linked to Noah or something?
Well, I mean, you have to look at all the details. Okay, you have to find the date. I actually tried to calculate the date, and other people have calculated the date. It's roughly to 2300 BCE. But actually, I tried to research it myself, and I found contradictions in the Old Testament, so I couldn't come up with
so
it.
you wouldn't like Robert's account mainly because you don't think it matches up with the dating in the Old Testament?
No, well, like I said, I think it's very difficult to date. Here's one dating that I tried to create.
Oh, okay. I see what you're saying. So the dating in the Old Testament is too ambiguous, and therefore, just because you find a flood in that region, you can't really say, "Oh, look, that must be Noah's flood," because you can't really tell where in the Old Testament Noah's flood is, like chronologically.
Right. Well, here's some dates.
Okay.
Bishop Ussher, for example, his famous Bible chronology. He places at even 1650 years after the creation, or at 2348 BCE is when he places it. And I tried to do the calculations, but again, I couldn't come up with an exact time. But if you start at Solomon's reign is dated from 970 to 950 BCE by most scholars. And then First Kings says that the Exodus occurred 480 years before Solomon started to work on the temple. Okay, so I'm going backwards here from Solomon's reign. And then Exodus 12:40 states that the Israelites lived in Egypt for 430 years. And then Genesis 12 states Abraham was 75 years old when God gave him the promise to make him a great nation. And then you have the 9 names between Shem and Abraham, which adds up to 350 years. And then Genesis 11:10, it says that Shem was 100 years old 2 years after the flood. So you add up all those dates, and that gets you to 2307 BCE, which is very close to Bishop Ussher's dating. So roughly around 2300 BCE is when you can date Noah's flood. But again, you have to look at the verses of the flood, what's trying to apply to, what's trying to imply, and so forth. And I think it overwhelmingly applies that it was a worldwide flood to wipe out creation because of man's sin. God wanted to start over. He wanted to wipe out all men because of their sin, just not a local region.
Floyd, sorry to interrupt, but I don't quite understand. You said that on the one hand, you said that it was hard to date the flood, and then you gave an answer 300 BCE. I didn't quite get where the difficulty is. In the dating part.
It's hard to get an exact date. I mean, you can get a rough date around 2300 BCE, but
what kind of precision are you wanting here? Because that's only an error of 40 years between those two dates there.
I mean, if that's good enough for you, then that's fine. Yeah.
Well, I'm saying that the error in dating geological events is typically higher than 50 years, and so you look at the margin of error on radiometric dating, and I think carbon dating is like 100 years or something like that.
Uh-huh.
So I don't see how you can say that 40 years is too imprecise whenever most geological scientific, or most of the methods of geology have a margin of error of much, much higher than 40 years.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you can find a global flood at 2300 BCE.
Oh, so your problem actually isn't with the dating. So the dating's not the problem. The real problem is that you feel that it was a global planetary flood. That's actually your argument.
I don't believe it. I don't believe we should interpret the story as a global flood. I said since the beginning of the Hangout that we should interpret the flood story in the Bible as a worldwide flood in context of a flat Earth cosmology.
Okay. But what I'm saying is that those are two separate arguments. On the one hand, you're saying there can never be evidence for it because it's impossible to date. And then on the other hand, you're saying that it's actually this, you're disagreeing with the hermeneutics. So that's why I'm confused, is that you started off by talking about the dating, and then you kind of like switched and went back to your script about how it's a worldwide flood on a flat Earth. So I'm just trying to understand the dating, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, as I showed you, you can get a approximate date if you go by the Old Testament. But some people claim like the gap theory. I think even general adheres to the gap theory that the Old Testament might be missing gaps in generations and so forth. I had
Just something I was going to say as well.
Yeah, I have come across contradictions where I found gaps in the dates and so forth. I'm willing to even give you 100-year range. If you can find a flood within 100 years, plus or minus 2300 BCE, I think that's fine, or maybe even 200. That's fine as well. I mean, usually a generation of the Bible is considered 40 years.
Luke, did you want to say something more, or can I jump in?
Well, no, I didn't. I don't think I had anything. Because my next question was going to ask what is an acceptable margin of error dating something like this. But you just said plus or minus 200 years, or maybe even plus or minus 100 years.
I'm just throwing that out.
Okay, so if the margin of error is plus or minus 100 years, and you get two dates that are within 40 years of each other, then I guess the dating method isn't really a problem.
Well, again, if you have one or two floods in that time, how do you decide which one's Noah's flood?
I still don't understand exactly what your argument is. Here's what I do understand. What I do understand is saying it's problematic to identify which one is the event, like which is the geological event you're trying to identify. A problem,
right?
But and I understand that. But what I'm saying is, what I don't understand is how that's supposed to be, like how you're arguing from your position. Like, are you saying that since you can't identify it, there can never be evidence for it? Is that what you're saying?
Well, no. If you have 5 local floods around the area within that 200-year span, how can you possibly identify which one is Noah's flood?
Well, sure. I'll say that it would be difficult to identify it, but I don't see how that undercuts the theory, if that makes sense. Like, here's what I'm getting at. Like, for example, suppose that we have records of an earthquake that happened in some area, and suppose that we can date within plus or minus 50 years of when it happened, but it turns out that there were 3 earthquakes in that time period, and we don't know which one of these 3 earthquakes the text that we have is referring to. That doesn't automatically say, well, the earthquake never happened, if that makes sense. It just says we don't know which one it was.
Right, but we have to look at the story of. We have to look at how the story describes the earthquake. What's unique about that earthquake, and can we identify that earthquake among other earthquakes? Like I mentioned, there's been a lot of local floods. How do we identify this supernatural or this unique flood
and this
over
this is where
other ones?
But that right, and that's an excellent point, Floyd. And this is what, in fact, can you see this? Can anyone see this?
Yeah,
I can see it.
Yeah, it looks like a video.
Yeah. So I paused it where, if you can see my mouse, this is a given fact. Like, geologists agree that roughly at the onset of the Holocene period, which is 15,000 years ago, when the Ice Age was practically finishing up, you have humans already existing in this region here. Now, the story in Genesis is very specific. Like you're saying, you're needing specifics. So it mentions 4 specific rivers, and the Pishon River they found as migrating off the Hijaz Mountains in this direction. Those are up here, obviously. The Kush rivers coming from the Armenian Mountains here, from the east over here, down into this specific pocket, which again is the foundation, so to speak, of all the Mesopotamian stuff that we understand. And Genesis calls this the Garden of Eden. So Noah would be in this pocket. And furthermore, in regards to the timing, so science is saying 13,000 years ago, this region is flooded, which, by the way, this video was made back in the 90s, and you'll see that thousands of years transpire at the bottom of this video. The point is that a paper in 2015 actually showcased that this transition of the waters filling in this region and hence flooding this region, because see, Garden of Eden would have been over here, and now you have this flooding taking place. And the 2015 paper, the author was basically arguing that, hang on a second, there's a lot of factors and variables you've forgotten or you weren't aware of. This flood could have happened within a year. I kid you not. This is a geophysicist. He's not a Christian. And purely in the context of this Persian Gulf flooding, it could have happened within a year. And interestingly, the Genesis account says that. And so...
Yeah, I mean, your video shows flooding over thousands of years, though.
Yeah, I specified that this video was made in the 90s. And so they thought that this flooding took place for over thousands of years. Like it slowly, filled in and obviously would have pushed people away from that region. But he's saying this entire flooding here happened within the space of 1 year. So now, what about the timing with respect to the chronology? Well, Genesis 5 can't be understood to be base 10. So therefore, Noah would easily fit well back 1000 BC period. And so I wouldn't put the flood in the 2000 BC margin. That's for sure. I mean, I'll just quickly, I'll give you an example from what's known as the Yalad form in the genealogies.
I have trouble buying the base 60 theory. Basically saying all the numbers in the Old Testament, or at least in the Pentateuch, are incorrect. The English translations of all the
basically Genesis 1 to 10 would fit under the base 60 category, because it's even maybe leaking into Abraham's story, but what's mentioned there is definitely Mesopotamian origin. And here's an example from the Gospel of Matthew in regards to genealogies. Would you say that Jesus is literally the son of David? The answer is yes or no. Yes, Jesus falls under the category of being in the lineage of David. But Jesus is not, like, in David's own generation, Jesus wasn't born. Same thing with when it says David is the son of Abraham. You wouldn't say David was born 2000 BC. So there's a huge generational gap between Jesus and Abraham in just this first verse in Matthew. And you see in the genealogies you were mentioning. So Bishop Usher then is like starts with his strict, chronology of what he does.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to point out, that with the gap theory and difficulties in the dating in the Old Testament, it's hard to date. I mean, if you take a literal interpretation of it and just assume that all the information is there, the best we can do is sometime around the 2300 BC. But there's a lot of problems with that, which you just pointed out.
A lot of noise. Yeah. In fact, I would argue that I don't think you can use the Bible to even place when Noah was existing. I mean, maybe you can do it with Abraham, but definitely not, with people like Noah. You'd have to appeal to science to understand when Noah would have existed, and with the human migration stuff and all that.
Yeah, I think, although I mean, I might be mistaken though, but the Old Testament does say how long Noah lived, and
Yep.
and if you take it literally, Noah would still be alive at the time of the Exodus, and then from there you can date the Exodus from Solomon's reign. So that would move up earlier, but again, if you have the gap theory and stuff like that,
but then you see that number, that figure falls into, okay, if we apply the Sumerian king list, base 60 stuff to all these names, and then make Noah's the base 10. In that sense, I think of being a bit sloppy. I take the whole thing as, base 60, and therefore again, it falls into that category of you can't, place a date to where Noah was and all that. And Floyd, I know that that what I'm saying, I would be thrown under the bus by young earth creationists. How dare you not?
Oh yeah, yeah. The young earth creationists would take a very literal. They would say, it was a global flood that happened around 2300 BC, and.
I kid you not. Ken Ham actually has an article on his website saying the pyramids. What did he say? The pyramids were made after the flood, so that means the pyramids had to have existed 2000 BC onwards or something like that. Like totally contradicting the fact that pyramids, go thousands of years prior to that. And it's just that, what do you call it, cognitive bias or something? I don't know. Just the complete lack of dissonance. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's there's a lot of problems. If you claim that the Noah's flood was a global flood that happened 2300 BCE, you have a lot of problems that you have to deal with, and it's just not reconcilable. The old theory that kangaroos were blasted to Australia from a volcanic explosion and stuff like that.
Is that? No, I'm just wondering. I've heard that before, but is that? Can you tell me? Is that a legitimate argument that was made, or was that just a tongue-in-cheek comment?
It's hard. I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say. I've heard it a number of times as well, and I'm not sure, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I don't know what was the best argument that they made? Like, have you heard of any argument how kangaroos finally reached Australia?
I remember Ken Hogan, had a lecture on that. I think he was saying that they could at the time there was a land bridge to Australia and things like that. But it's speculating. Well, it could have happened this way. And of course, there's no fossils. You find fossils between Middle East and Australia. You don't find them either.
Obviously, kangaroos existed tens of thousands of years prior to. Well, I may be speculating here, but wasn't kangaroos? So, if kangaroos were to be on the ark, they'd have to hop to Mesopotamia to survive, and then hop back to Australia. Like, weren't they already existing in Australia well before?
No, I think they would argue that
the flood
lived in the Middle East and just migrated. Of course, there's no evidence of that. There's no fossil record of that or anything.
Yeah, but we understand that kangaroos already were in Australia, and then because this global flood was to happen, they had to hop all the way to the Ark, and then once that stopped, then come back again to Australia. Like if kangaroos pre-existed.
Well,
and that just
then that presupposes an old Earth, though. I mean, they're young Earth creationists, so.
I'm just saying from our our proper natural understanding of history. That's what I'm concluding. If that was the case, like it'd have to hop there and back.
Yeah, I mean, I can't explain it. Yeah, I wish a young Earth creationist was in here to defend that. But yeah, I think there are. I think you can watch YouTube videos of Kent Hovind, defending the kangaroo problem.
I think I have a general idea what at least some of the young Earthers would go for, which would be just like, oh, it was Pangea back then, the flood broke it up, so the kangaroos didn't have to hop that far. But yeah.
Yeah, the continental drift would be amazing in that short period of time, wouldn't it?
Yep.
I think Kent Hovind maybe said there was a land bridge or something.
What if they had like a whole series of yachts to take the kangaroos over, instead of plate tectonics?
Yeah, Dragon Lady Rides Again basically took us on that.
Maybe they floated on debris. Maybe they took a canoe to Australia.
Yeah.
Yeah, Floyd, there's a inside joke between me and Mark on the yacht stuff. So.
Aboriginals on the canoe.
I had a good one. What happened to the dinosaurs? Well, that's what they ate on the Ark. So so dinosaurs are on the Ark, but they killed it. They ate them on the Ark. So that's why the dinosaurs were extinct, because they all were eaten to feed the other animals on the Ark.
My question is
similar stories to turtles. That I mean, turtles in the Galapagos went extinct because they ate them all.
My question is that how, because they're actually dinosaurs in Australia, how did they get there?
I actually speculated that they just overfed the kangaroos while they were on the Ark, so they grew to like 500-600 foot, and then all of the other marsupials jumped in the pouches of these two kangaroos, and then they hopped across because they could make a big hop, and then over the rest of the period of time, they obviously shrink back down again to the current size. I think that's as likely as the global flood story.
Yeah, I mean, another issue is, how could freshwater fish survive? They'll come up with, oh, well, there are fish that can live in both, saltwater and freshwater. But yeah, that's like 1-2% of the fish population. So you accounted for 1% of the fish population. How do you account for the other 99% of it? I mean, that's no argument to point out, oh, well, there is a species of fish that can live in both freshwater. Okay, you accounted for one species. What about all the rest of them?
Yeah. Especially as, this is in some way their answer to diversity, right? Which is the reason we see diversity is because there's an Ark and all of the animals went on it. That's why we see diversity. Not anything to do with evolution, of course. So it's actually ridiculous that they're kind of arguing against themselves, right? And they go, oh, here's all these kinds. Well, we found loads more kinds since then, and they can't all fit on this boat. At the time, they may not have known of, marsupials and all of these other kinds of animals, which is why they came up with a stupid idea to explain diversity like an Ark. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I mean, like I argued before, the context of the stories and it's a worldwide flood with a flat Earth cosmology, and their view of the Earth was much smaller. They didn't know Australia or Japan or even the Americas existed at the time. It's just it's very ignorant. They just didn't know about it at the time. But then but now modern Christians who want to make sense out of the story and think it's still relevant, have to come up with different theories to justify the story.
Would that be sort of like just like with science?
How so?
Like what I mean is that like it's not, because like if you take the framework interpretation, you would see it more like a allegory, the Genesis 1 to 11, right? But when you go to like when you go to something as literal like young Earth creationism, you'd have to try and reconcile it with the science that we have.
Right. Or deny the science.
Oh yeah, deny the science, obviously. Yeah. And so, it was common that everyone thought the Earth was flat in the ancient Near East. But yet, I've been reading these books on, scripture and how it's harmonized with science, and it's just the most ridiculous things I've heard in my entire life. Like there's no way that they thought that the Earth was spherical. They thought it was flat, like a disc.
Yeah, and that's how the ancient Near East cultures viewed the world. So when you read the Bible, you should take that in account. Don't try to interpret the Bible with our modern scientific knowledge. Try to understand it in the way they understood the world. And when you do that, you will make better sense out of the Bible.
Yeah.
But Floyd, one second. I'll give Floyd an example where, so when sailors would utilize a geocentric model for ship navigation, to pinpoint certain geographical regions of where to go, what cities, and so on. Notice that we know that the geocentric model is false. We live in a heliocentric solar system. But we would not disagree with the fact that, say we were on the Pacific right now, and say we utilize the exact same methodology, the same mathematics of a geocentric model to navigate, say if you're in the middle of the Pacific and we needed to go, like ahead of us could be Japan and behind us would be North America. And then maybe if we wanted to pinpoint more accurately a specific location in Japan to sail to and so on. The interesting thing is that these primitive cultures left behind, including more recently in right up to the thousands AD, in this case using geocentrism as an analogy, that they were still accurate in regards to, in this case, with ship navigation, they would accurately pinpoint, okay, this is where this city is, and this is where this country is, and so on. Obviously with a very primitive cosmology. And we just come on top of that, and we update it more into a far more advanced, model, and obviously a more accurate model. And so when I look to the Genesis story, yes, ancient Near Eastern elements right throughout. But at the same time, embedded in the text are all these truths that, let's see if, people like Jeffrey Rose and his work, let's see if it comports with that stuff. And sure enough, it does. So I honestly don't see why we should just remain, skeptical. At least, what I'm saying is at least there's a blend.
I could kind of give you a reason, but if Floyd wants to come back on that first, he's more the expert.
Well, I'd want to know what you think does match. I just don't see it.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that actually that the so-called truths in the Bible are actually
well, I don't know. You broke up.
Did he cut off for you too?
previous. Yeah. Sorry, yeah, I would argue that things like the Babylonian mathematics was much more advanced than was included in the Bible. So clearly, there's some kind of degradation of the information through the Bible. Right?
Actually, no.
The Greeks 500 years earlier, right, had such things as sophisticated proofs, pi, etc. That those things are misrepresented in the Bible.
Actually, well,
the flood story is another good example, where there's a much more interesting.
No. I think what's already embedded in the text, you see an evolution of going along with the culture. So, for example, pi in Babylonian math. Curiously, when you look at the passage in Kings, it matches with the Septuagint, which is a Greek work, and hence, coming from Alexandria, they were well aware of the actual value for pi.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I'm getting at.
Actually,
I mean, it seems to be a mistake in the Bible.
Yeah.
If they knew of pi and what the significance of pi was, then they kind of made an obvious error, shall we say?
I don't think you should try to find an accurate.
My point here being
pi in the Bible.
Sure.
I don't think they were trying to do that.
Sure, I agree with you. They weren't necessarily. They weren't referring to it, and this is why I'm saying that it's actually a degradation of information through that particular book. Whereas clearly in previous cultures, up to 300-400 years earlier, many of those things were known. And in Babylonian times, the cosmology in Babylonian times was more sophisticated. They had a few hundred years of data. Right?
Could you give me an example?
Well, the data
you need to
that Kepler used to work out the heliocentric model, for instance.
Because the Babylonians, basically, we have the Babylonian map, which is
Steppa, you broke up.
Yeah, you're cutting out for me too.
Oh, sorry. I am in Australia after all. So, yeah, but the Babylonian map, it was just an ancient Near Eastern cosmology worldview. Just a flat Earth, a dome around the Earth, some seas, that sort of thing. Is that sort of what you mean?
No, I actually meant that they had data, had stored data of the cosmological details, right? So the position of the stars and the way they circulated.
Ah, yeah.
And then they'd kept records.
Yeah, but you're talking
140 years.
What about
those records?
Everyone had those.
Yeah, but the dating of this is in the 600s and 500s BC. It's not. You're talking, say, when Solomon was around, you're talking that's going back 900 BC plus.
Right. I think you're talking maybe 1500 BC for the Babylonians.
No. That form of Babylonian math is way too primitive for the stuff that you see in the 500s BC.
No, I would disagree, because they have found a cuneiform tablet where the value of the square root of 2 was worked out to 3 decimal places.
Yeah, but that's not the equivalent. I know about the tablet, and Norman Wildberger is
very sophisticated mathematics.
Not really. I mean, the way they go about it is like Norman. A mathematician in Australia. His name is Norman Wildberg. He's actually analyzed that specific tablet, and it's very recent.
It is, yes. But it shows that the level of sophistication that the Babylonians were at compared to the Egyptians at the time. That's for sure.
No, that's true.
Yeah.
And the Egyptians, still got pi right. They realized that they realized Pythagoras' theorem. They may not have understood what it was or the proof of it, but they at least identified members of the set. Right.
Mm.
Again, more sophisticated than the Bible text.
But the Egyptians, in 2013, they found that the star Algol, with its periodicity, they found that the Egyptians were correct to, I think, 2 or 3 places of the decimal, which is quite fascinating. And that would date back at least 2,300 years, that particular, discussion.
I'm not sure what that is, General, to be honest with you. Yeah,
it's a star. I mean, again, this is what I meant. In a geocentric, flat Earth cosmological framework, they were still writing accurate details in regards to, in this case, Algol, the star.
That's not surprising.
Within the midst,
flat Earth or globe Earth, that makes no difference to those.
But that's yeah, exactly. That's my point. So my point, coming back to the flood again, there's no real difference. If I was a geocentrist and yet I would still specify particular rivers, particular names, how long, the duration of this, flood event that's happening, all these other elements are embedded in a culture that already has this framework, which, from our framework, we're just a much more advanced framework and a much more accurate framework that's going, oh yeah, no, we know that your cosmology is primitive, but all these other finer details that you have mentioned is actually, yeah, it's correct.
Yeah, and that says to me that there was a finer detail, there was a higher technological achievement in a previous age, and this book did not transfer those details very well, even though it purports to try to in some way. Another example, of course, is for me would be Titus, where they present the liar's paradox and then conclude that there is an answer to it. And that's pragmatic. So yes, I see the reason why they've done that, but of course it misses the point that the Greeks had of stating what the liar's paradox is, that it is in fact a paradox. So it's things like that. It just misses the point slightly. And when you go back to previous ages, all of those points had been made in different cultures, which clearly the Bible is drawing upon. So it would say to me that although they tried to understand the higher levels of technology of these other cultures, they were struggling to do so.
Yeah, I agree. And I think what a younger creationist will try and say, which in my opinion, it's just a faulty view of inspiration, that they won't allow that. They won't allow that error margin to creep in, even in the Holy Scripture, because they think that if that's included, then God is wrong.
Yeah, I mean,
and that view of inspiration is faulty.
Sure. I can't remember which one it was, whether it was Aquinas, maybe, that had said something like, I wish we'd never taken the Old Testament. I wish when the Christians had first constructed it, they'd just left it at the New Testament.
Well, Marcion had the same view as well.
Was that Marcion? I could well be wrong here, Floyd. I'm an ignoramus on these things. So, thank you for the correction.
Marcion was considered a heretic.
Yeah, Marcion. It is the Gnostic, right?
Well, not quite. Yeah, Marcionites and the Gnostics did share some things in common, but
okay.
I don't think scholars would consider Marcion a Gnostic, full Gnostic. It's very similar, though.
And that, go ahead, Wayne. Sorry.
I was going to say we got about 5 more minutes, and then I'll go off here because I'm only supposed to be doing this till 11. Gotta go to sleep and stuff. But somebody did. Well, I guess it's not even a question. It's really a. They said, why can't God inspire text and get this blank right? From Max Shepard. In my view, and I guess you would agree too. When I look at the flood account and when I look at the other different accounts in the Old Testament or even throughout the Bible, I actually don't believe in what's the word? Not concordance, although I don't necessarily believe in that too. What's the word, General? It has to do with inspiration. It's the way Muslims see inspiration.
Mechanical inspiration of the text, like letter for letter with yeah.
Where it's perfect. The text is perfect.
Dictation.
You get in there.
Recitation.
Well, long story short, I just don't think the text is perfect. I don't think God came down from heaven and wrote the Bible, or God was telling these people what to write the whole time. I think The Bible was written by people just like any other historical book, and so of course they would have had like copying errors or maybe spelling mistakes, or even they may have gotten some things wrong. Oh my gosh, that's so crazy. They may have gotten some things actually incorrect. I don't think the Bible is perfect. I do think it's at least historically reliable when it counts. And that's all you need. I mean, I don't think you need to make it like this magic book where like you can open it up like an 8-ball and like it gives you everything. I don't think that was the purpose for it. God used fallible people to write a book which has mistakes and errors and stuff in it. And you know, these people are writing from their ancient and their Eastern perspective, so they didn't know anything about modern science and physics and all that stuff.
Yeah, just to add to that, your name's
God,
Wayne, right? Yeah, just to add to
yep.
that, Wayne. Imagine if God did reveal the Bible in an akin manner to God revealing, say, or the angel Moroni revealing the Book of Mormon, or Allah and Gabriel revealing the Quran, then think about how easy it would be to falsify this as coming from God in any sense, right? Because the Quran and the Book of Mormon, because they do claim to be a dictatum, verbatim word of God, when you look at the criterion those texts lay out, you can easily see that they're easily falsified, right? But in the Bible, you can't be like, well, in Matthew's gospel, it says X, and in Mark's gospel, it says not X. Therefore, let's throw the whole thing out. Let's put it in the trash can. Like, if that was a criterion that God used, then I don't know if I don't even know if if it would be a good idea to even write a scripture if that was the criterion, because those religions are easily falsified. And even when it comes to like the most brilliant people we can imagine, right? Even if, like, let's say God gave the Bible to a bunch of physicists or mathematicians, right? We still have problems with this because, like, elite and educated people of all time, Aristotle and Plato, etc., at least in that period of the world, themselves was subject to a whole bunch of criticism, and some of it, of course, was legitimate. So even the most intelligent of men seem to regard. So yeah, I think it's a good idea that God was, let's just say, quote unquote, less rigid in the way that he interacts with mankind. Anyway, go ahead.
Sure. I guess you could put it that way. He didn't have this criteria like, oh my gosh, I should reveal the secrets of the universe to somebody like Stephen Hawking or whatever, in which he could, but God simply just chose to accommodate his plans to the understanding of these ancient. And I'll tell you what.
Yeah, but Wayne, just quickly, Wayne. What Mark's also trying to say is, say Stephen Hawking receives revelation from, I'll use Allah here to be a little bit of a contrarian, like Gabriel is like Ikra, recite Allah's word, and Stephen Hawking's like, I don't know what to say, using the Muhammad story.
Well, this is why I like.
The
astronomer Hugh Ross. I know General knows him, but he talks about God kind of revealing two books, kind of like the book of nature and the book of scripture, or that which is written, and that which is where he even says things like, astronomy is the only directly observable past science, and so nature in that sense, and I think Romans 1:20 etc. would corroborate with that. But there's your revelation to Stephen Hawking. In fact, I would say in general, you can feel free to dispute this, but I would say that the kind of ad hoc contrivations that they come up with, or contrivances they came up with, often are to kind of avoid the problem of where the general natural revelation is pointing to, right? So even when they are given, fine tuning, for example, was a pretty radical type of evidence, but yet that's not compelling to many of them. So even with the best of the best, even like Hawking's. And he'll admit the fine-tuning properties, and he'll even admit it points to a designer, but then he says, you know, he's stuck with a purely physical or mechanistic approach. What you're saying, General?
Yeah, and at the end of the day, someone like Hawking would have to be accommodated. God would have to limit himself down to his level and just work like God does. God's not gonna suddenly zap him with new knowledge or new way of thinking, which again, it's kind of like an infinite regression. How far does God have to go to model what truly is true relative to a finite mind like Hawking?
I don't know. It's almost like a caricature. Like, imagine if God was like a genie off Aladdin. Like, that's a caricature of God, right? It wouldn't be something like think about like in terms of like the Einsteinian opinion of God, where none of the laws of physics are ever violated, or, you know, they're all working in the synchronicity and symmetry, and that's the true, that's, you know, that's an ideal kind of a true beauty of like, and you can kind of miraculous elements like consciousness, free will and such, and it just gets, the picture gets more grander and grander. But yeah, go ahead.
Well,
that's all I was going to say. Yeah.
It does seem to me that that analogy to the genie in the lamp, well, that is the analogy that they are using in the Old Testament quite often.
Interesting. But I'm going to go off here. You guys can have this discussion off here. I got to go to sleep. I'm done. All right, guys. Have a good night.